The moment I watched $37 million vanish from our clients' accounts in real time, I knew my sabotage had worked perfectly. 7 years I had spent building the most sophisticated fraud detection system in banking history, and it took me exactly 30 minutes to dismantle it all. The chairman's spoiled son thought firing me would be easy. He had no idea I had embedded fail-safes that only I could control. As sirens wailed through First National's headquarters and federal agents stormed the building, I smiled, knowing justice was finally being served. My name is Jerry, and looking back now, I can see how naive I was when I first walked through the marble lobby of First National Bank of Colorado at 25 years old, fresh out of MIT with my computer science degree and dreams of revolutionizing financial security. The building itself was imposing, all glass and steel, reaching toward the Denver skyline. But what captivated me was the promise of protecting families from financial predators. Those early days feel like a lifetime ago. I remember working in a cramped basement office with flickering fluorescent lights and the constant hum of servers. The space was nothing like the executive suites 40 floors above, but I loved every inch of it because it was where I could build something meaningful. My desk was an old metal thing covered in coffee stains and sticky notes, surrounded by towers of technical manuals and empty energy drink cans. The Guardian Protocol started as a simple idea during my second week on the job. I had noticed patterns in transaction data that reminded me of biological immune systems, and I wondered if we could create artificial intelligence that would learn to recognize financial threats the way our bodies learn to fight viruses. What began as weekend experiments soon became my obsession. Marcus Williams joined my team 6 months later, a brilliant data analyst from the University of Colorado who could spot statistical anomalies faster than anyone I had ever met. He was quiet and methodical, always carrying a worn leather notebook where he sketched probability curves by hand. Sarah Chen came aboard the following year as our cybersecurity specialist, bringing expertise in network intrusion detection that perfectly complemented my fraud algorithms. Tom Rodriguez rounded out our core group as systems architect, a former military communications specialist who understood how to build bulletproof infrastructure. Together, we worked 18-hour days sleeping on office couches and surviving on vending machine snacks. The basement became our fortress, walls covered with flowcharts and code printouts, whiteboards filled with equations that looked like abstract art to outsiders. We were building something revolutionary, and the excitement kept us going through exhaustion and frustration. The Guardian Protocol evolved into something beautiful. Machine learning algorithms that could analyze millions of transactions simultaneously. Behavioral analysis engines that detected subtle changes in spending patterns, real-time, monitoring systems that flagged suspicious activity within milliseconds. The system learned constantly, adapting to new fraud techniques faster than criminals could develop them. Our first major test came during my 3rd year, when hackers attempted what newspapers later called the Denver digital heist. $15 million in coordinated wire transfers, all designed to look legitimate until you examined the patterns. Guardian Protocol caught every single attempt within seconds, triggering lockdowns that saved the bank from catastrophe. That victory earned me recognition from Bank President Harrison Caldwell, a distinguished man in his early 60s, who seemed genuinely impressed by our innovation. The second attack came 2 years later, more sophisticated and targeted specifically at our defense systems. Foreign criminals had studied our public security presentations and crafted malware designed to blind our detection algorithms. But Guardian Protocol had evolved beyond their understanding, incorporating defensive strategies they could not anticipate. Another complete victory, another round of praise from Harrison. The third attempt nearly succeeded. State-sponsored hackers with unlimited resources and inside knowledge of American banking protocols launched a coordinated assault on 17 financial institutions simultaneously. Most banks suffered significant losses, but Guardian Protocol held firm, protecting not just First National, but sharing critical threat intelligence that helped other institutions minimize their damage. Yet despite these successes, despite saving the bank hundreds of millions of dollars, despite industry recognition and speaking invitations at cybersecurity conferences, I remained in that same basement office. While male colleagues with fewer accomplishments received promotions to vice president and senior director positions, I was told my work was too specialized for executive leadership. The breaking point came during a board meeting I was not invited to attend. I had arrived early to set up a presentation about our latest security upgrades when I heard voices from the conference room. Through the partially open door, I could see Harrison addressing the directors about staffing decisions. "Jerry Walsh is exceptional at what she does," Harrison was saying, his voice carrying the measured tone he used for difficult topics. "But we need to be realistic about career trajectories. Women in technical roles often lack the killer instinct necessary for executive leadership. They are collaborative and detail-oriented, which makes them excellent specialists, but they hit their ceiling eventually. We should appreciate her contributions without creating unrealistic expectations." The words hit me like a physical blow. This man who had praised my work publicly, who had claimed to mentor my career, saw me as fundamentally limited by my gender. 7 years of dedication of sacrificing personal relationships and health for the bank's success meant nothing because I was viewed as incapable of true leadership. I quietly closed my laptop and returned to the basement, but something had changed permanently. The naive young woman who believed hard work and excellence would be rewarded was gone, replaced by someone who understood that loyalty meant nothing without mutual respect. Brandon Caldwell arrived at First National on a crisp October morning with all the confidence that comes from knowing your father owns the building. At 28, he possessed the kind of effortless arrogance that only comes from never facing real consequences, coupled with an MBA from Wharton that he mentioned within the first 5 minutes of every conversation. I first encountered him during what he called a strategic assessment meeting, though it felt more like an interrogation. The conference room on the 38th floor was a temple to corporate power, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Denver, a mahogany table that could seat 20, and leather chairs that probably cost more than my annual salary. Brandon sat at the head like a king holding court, flanked by 3 consulting friends who nodded enthusiastically at everything he said. "So you are the famous Jerry Walsh," Brandon said, not bothering to stand when I entered. His handshake was limp, distracted eyes already scanning his phone screen. "I have heard interesting things about your little computer program." Little computer program. 7 years of innovation reduced to a dismissive phrase from someone who probably could not code a simple calculator app. "Guardian Protocol has prevented over $400 million in losses since implementation," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the condescension dripping from his tone. "The system currently monitors 8.7 million accounts across our entire network, processing approximately 12 million transactions daily." Chad Morrison, one of Brandon's consulting buddies, laughed like I had told a joke. "Those numbers sound impressive, but what is the total cost of ownership? How much are we spending on hardware, personnel, and maintenance compared to modern outsourced solutions?" This was my cue to launch into the presentation I had prepared, but Brandon interrupted before I could begin. "Actually, let me save us all some time. I have been reviewing our operational expenses, and your department represents a significant drain on resources. We are talking about 8 full-time employees, dedicated server infrastructure, and constant upgrades for what amounts to pattern recognition software." Dylan Parker, the efficiency expert, opened his laptop and projected cost analysis charts onto the wall display. "Based on our preliminary research, we can achieve equivalent fraud protection through Secure Logic Solutions, a proven provider with implementations across 43 countries. Their standardized platform would reduce our annual security costs by 62% while providing access to global threat intelligence." The numbers on his charts were meaningless without context, but they looked impressive to someone who valued savings over security. I attempted to explain why local knowledge mattered, why American banking patterns required specialized algorithms, why real-time response capabilities could not be outsourced to servers on the other side of the world. Brandon yawned audibly during my explanation. "Look, kiddo, I appreciate your passion, but this is bigger than one person's pet project. We need scalable solutions that can grow with our business, not legacy code that only one employee understands." Austin Chen, the cost reduction specialist, delivered the final blow. "Secure Logic has offered us a comprehensive package that includes fraud monitoring, compliance reporting, and customer authentication for less than half of what we currently spend on internal development. They are launching their American division next quarter and want First National as their flagship client." The meeting concluded with Brandon dismissing my concerns as resistance to change, Walking back to my basement office, I felt the walls closing in around 7 years of work. Everything I had built was being reduced to a line item on a spreadsheet, evaluated by people who could not distinguish between genuine security and marketing presentations. But the real shock came 3 days later, when I discovered Brandon had already signed a letter of intent with SecureLogic Solutions without board approval. The document, accidentally left on a printer near my office, outlined a timeline for transitioning all fraud detection capabilities to their Mumbai-based operations center within 90 days. My entire team would be eliminated. The Guardian protocol would be decommissioned. 7 years of innovation would be replaced by generic software designed for markets with completely different fraud patterns and regulatory requirements. Brandon was not just cutting costs, he was positioning himself as the visionary leader who modernized First National's operations regardless of the consequences. My team and I were obstacles to his narrative, inconvenient reminders that quality sometimes costs more than the cheapest alternative. The letter of intent included termination packages for all affected employees, generous enough to discourage lawsuits, but calculated to clear the way for Brandon's outsourcing plan. He had already decided our fate before bothering to evaluate our work. That night, I stayed late in the basement office staring at 7 years of code scrolling across my monitor. Hundreds of thousands of lines of carefully crafted algorithms, each one representing hours of thought and testing, all destined for deletion. Guardian Protocol was not just software to me. It was proof that dedication and expertise mattered, that protecting innocent families from financial predators was worth the effort. But Brandon saw it as nothing more than expensive legacy code created by an employee who made him feel old. The systematic destruction of my professional credibility began subtly with small changes that could be explained away as administrative adjustments. My access to the main security monitoring systems was downgraded from administrator to read only ostensibly for compliance standardization. Meeting invitations for fraud prevention strategy sessions stopped arriving with Brandon's assistant, explaining that my input was no longer needed for forward-looking discussions. The cruelest twist was being assigned to train SecureLogic's technical representatives on the very systems I had created. Priya Sharma, a talented programmer from their Mumbai office, arrived with genuine enthusiasm for learning Guardian Protocol's architecture. She had no idea she was being used to eliminate my job, and I found myself in the impossible position of helping a decent person become my replacement. "Your algorithm design is remarkably sophisticated," Priya said during one of our training sessions studying the behavioral analysis code with obvious admiration. "The pattern recognition engine adapts faster than anything I have seen in commercial fraud detection. How long did this take to develop?" 7 years of constant refinement, I replied, trying to keep bitterness out of my voice. Each module represents hundreds of hours of testing against real-world attack patterns. The system learns from every attempt, building defenses against techniques that have not even been invented yet. Priya's discomfort was palpable as she began understanding the ethical implications of her assignment. In my previous role at Bangalore National Bank, we implemented SecureLogic's standard package. It is adequate for basic fraud prevention, but nothing like this level of sophistication. Why would First National want to replace something so advanced? I could not answer honestly without putting both our jobs at risk. But Priya was intelligent enough to read between the lines. She began documenting Guardian Protocol's capabilities with meticulous detail, perhaps recognizing that preserving this knowledge was more important than corporate politics. Meanwhile, my team members started disappearing one by one. Marcus was transferred to consumer lending analysis, his statistical expertise wasted on loan approval algorithms. Sarah was moved to network administration, maintaining email servers instead of hunting cybercriminals. Tom found himself assigned to hardware procurement, his systems architecture skills reduced to ordering replacement keyboards and monitors. Each transfer was presented as a promotion or lateral move with growth opportunities, but the message was clear. Brandon was dismantling my department piece by piece, scattering our expertise across the organization where it could not threaten his outsourcing plans. The psychological warfare escalated when I discovered Brandon had been recording our private conversations. During a supposedly confidential discussion about security vulnerabilities, I noticed his phone positioned at an unusual angle screen indicating active recording. When I confronted him about it, He laughed and claimed it was for documentation purposes. "You tend to speak quickly when discussing technical details," he said with mock concern. "I want to make sure I capture all your insights accurately. Surely you appreciate thoroughness in business communications." What I learned later was that Brandon had been editing these recordings, cutting my responses out of context to make me sound insubordinate and unprofessional. A conversation where I explained why certain security measures were essential became a recording of me resisting necessary changes. My attempts to clarify technical requirements were twisted into examples of difficult personality traits. These edited recordings found their way to HR Director Jennifer Walsh, a company loyalist who had learned to survive by never questioning management decisions. When I tried to file a complaint about Brandon's harassment, she dismissed my concerns with practiced indifference. "I have reviewed the documentation of your recent interactions with Brandon Caldwell," Jennifer said, consulting a thick folder that presumably contained Brandon's manufactured evidence. "There seems to be a pattern of resistance to new leadership and unwillingness to adapt to changing business priorities. Perhaps you should consider whether your career goals align with the bank's current direction." The folder contained performance evaluations. I had never seen incident reports I had never been asked to respond to, and witness statements from employees who had never worked with me directly. Brandon had constructed an elaborate fiction about my professional conduct, complete with supporting documentation and corroborating testimonies. Even Harrison Caldwell, my supposed mentor, began avoiding contact. Our monthly check-in meetings were canceled without explanation. When I encountered him in hallways, he would nod politely but find excuses to end conversations quickly. The man who had praised my innovations now treated me like a stranger, perhaps already convinced by his son's narrative that I was a problem employee. The final insult came when my parking space in the employee garage was reassigned to visiting consultants. 7 years of arriving early and staying late earned me the privilege of circling downtown Denver looking for street parking while Brandon's friends enjoyed covered spaces 20 feet from the elevator. My office supplies began disappearing. Requisition requests were denied for budgetary reasons, and my computer was scheduled for replacement with an outdated model that could not run the development software I needed for system maintenance. Every aspect of my work environment was being degraded systematically, creating conditions that would force any reasonable person to quit. But I was not ready to abandon 7 years of work without a fight. Instead, I began documenting everything with the same meticulous attention I applied to fraud detection. Every email, every conversation, every policy violation was recorded and saved to secure servers outside the bank's network. If Brandon wanted to play games, I would make sure I had evidence of his methods. The documentation revealed a pattern of discrimination that went beyond personal animosity. Brandon was systematically targeting experienced employees who might question his decisions, replacing institutional knowledge with compliant consultants who would implement his vision without resistance. I was not his only victim, just his most visible target. As I compiled evidence of Brandon's campaign against me, I realized something important. The man was not just incompetent and arrogant. He was actively dangerous to the bank's stability and security. His outsourcing plan would leave First National vulnerable to exactly the kind of sophisticated attacks that Guardian Protocol was designed to prevent. The question was whether anyone in authority would listen before it was too late. Brandon's summons to his office arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other, but I knew from the formal tone of his assistant's email that this was the endgame. 7 years of dedication was about to be reduced to a termination meeting in a redecorated office that now bore no resemblance to the workspace his father had used for building relationships with employees. The 39th floor executive suite had been transformed into Brandon's vision of modern corporate leadership. Gone were Harrison's family photos and community awards, replaced by abstract art that probably cost more than most people's cars. The traditional mahogany furniture had been swapped for sleek glass and steel pieces that looked impressive but felt cold and impersonal. Brandon's Wharton MBA diploma hung prominently behind his desk, flanked by certificates from leadership seminars and business strategy workshops. "Please sit down," Brandon said without looking up from his laptop screen, gesturing toward a chair positioned to face him directly while he remained elevated behind the massive desk. The power dynamics were carefully choreographed, designed to make visitors feel small and subordinate. I have completed a comprehensive review of your performance and departmental efficiency. He continued, finally meeting my eyes with the kind of practiced indifference that comes from firing people regularly. Unfortunately, the results are quite concerning. He slid a manila folder across the desk, containing what he claimed was my official performance evaluation. The document was filled with terms like outdated technical approaches and resistance to organizational change and poor team leadership, resulting in departmental dysfunction. Every criticism was a carefully crafted distortion of reality. My outdated technical approaches were cutting-edge algorithms that had never failed to stop a fraud attack. My resistance to organizational change was insisting on security standards that protected customer assets. My poor team leadership was refusing to abandon 7 years of successful innovation for an untested outsourcing experiment. I am curious about your methodology here, I said, scanning the fabricated performance metrics. Guardian Protocol has maintained a 100% success rate against fraud attempts for 7 consecutive years. Our system has prevented over $400 million in losses. Customer satisfaction ratings for our fraud protection services are consistently in the 98th percentile. Which specific metrics support these negative conclusions? Brandon's smile was the kind reserved for explaining simple concepts to slow children. Jerry, I appreciate your passion for your work, but you are missing the bigger picture. Modern banking requires agile solutions that can scale globally. Your system, while historically effective, represents the kind of legacy thinking that holds financial institutions back from true innovation. The condescension in his voice was so thick I could practically taste it. This man who had never written a line of code, never analyzed a fraud pattern, never spent a sleepless night protecting customer accounts, was lecturing me about innovation. The banking industry is evolving toward standardized platforms that leverage collective intelligence. He continued, leaning back in his leather chair, with the confidence of someone who had memorized consulting presentations. Your insistence on proprietary solutions reflects an outdated mindset that prioritizes personal ownership over institutional efficiency. I tried one more time to reach whatever rational thought might exist behind his MBA jargon. Brandon Guardian Protocol is not just proprietary software. It represents 7 years of learning about specifically American fraud patterns, regional criminal organizations, and local banking behaviors. Outsourcing our fraud detection to Mumbai means starting over with algorithms designed for completely different markets and threat environments. His response was swift and devastating. You are 32 years old and still coding like you are fresh out of college. Your technology makes me feel like I am working with my grandmother. This bank needs fresh blood, not legacy employees clinging to yesterday's solutions. The personal attack landed exactly as intended. Brandon had found the perfect weapon to dismiss my expertise, ageism disguised as innovation advocacy. By framing my experience as obsolescence, he could justify replacing me with younger, cheaper alternatives who would implement his vision without question. My father worked at this bank for 30 years before his heart attack. I said, immediately regretting the personal disclosure but unable to stop myself. He believed financial institutions had a responsibility to protect working families, not just maximize profits. Brandon's laugh was genuinely cruel. That is exactly the problem. This family business mentality is what is holding us back. Modern banking requires corporate efficiency, not emotional attachments to employees or outdated loyalty concepts. The final blow came with casual brutality that revealed how thoroughly he had planned my destruction. I have already hired your replacement, actually. Jason Matthews, a brilliant young programmer from my Wharton network who specializes in implementing standardized fraud detection platforms. He starts Monday and will oversee the transition to SecureLogic's proven solutions. 24 years old, I learned later, fresh from business school with no real-world fraud detection experience, hired specifically because he would not question Brandon's outsourcing strategy. Jason's qualifications included enthusiasm for disruptive technologies and willingness to work for significantly less money than experienced professionals commanded. You have 30 minutes to clear out your desk and return all company property, Brandon concluded, already turning back to his laptop screen as if I had ceased to exist. Security will escort you to your office to ensure confidential materials remain protected. 30 minutes to pack up 7 years of my professional life. 30 minutes to say goodbye to systems I had built from nothing into the most sophisticated fraud detection platform in regional banking. 30 minutes before Guardian Protocol would be handed over to consultants who viewed it as obsolete legacy code waiting for deletion. But Brandon had made a critical error in his rush to humiliate me. He assumed I was just another employee who would accept termination quietly and disappear without causing problems. He had no idea that those same systems he dismissed as outdated included safeguards that only I could control. As I stood to leave his office, I turned back with a smile that confused him completely. I suppose I should mention something before I go. Guardian Protocol includes certain administrative protocols that require my personal oversight. You have about 30 minutes before every fraud alert in the system stops flagging suspicious activity. Brandon's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to genuine concern. What are you talking about? Tell your father I said good luck, I replied, walking out the door as his voice rose behind me, demanding explanations I was no longer obligated to provide. The countdown had begun, and there was nothing Brandon could do to stop what came next. The walk back to my basement office felt like a funeral procession, but inside my mind was calculating with the cold precision that had made Guardian Protocol so effective. 27 minutes until the first authentication servers would go offline. 26 minutes before pattern recognition algorithms would stop learning from new data. 25 minutes until 7 years of fraud protection would vanish from First National systems. Security guards were already waiting by my desk. Two men I had worked alongside for years, who now avoided eye contact while supervising my departure. Their discomfort was obvious, but orders from executive leadership override personal relationships in corporate hierarchies. "Take your time, Miss Walsh," said the older guard Robert Chen, who had always been friendly during late-night shifts when I worked past building security hours. "We are not here to rush you." But I did not need much time for the items that actually mattered. 7 years of work, reduced to a few personal photographs, a coffee mug from my MIT graduation, and a small cactus plant that had somehow survived the basement's artificial lighting. Everything else belonged to Guardian Protocol, and Guardian Protocol was about to become Brandon's problem. The beautiful irony was that my termination had been planned so carefully, yet no one had considered the technical implications of firing the only person who understood the system's deepest levels. Brandon's consulting friends had evaluated Guardian Protocol like any commercial software package, assuming it could be transferred to new operators with basic documentation and training materials. They had no idea about the safeguards I had embedded during those long nights when paranoia about corporate betrayal first began creeping into my thoughts. Every programmer develops personal coding habits, but I had taken security precautions that went far beyond industry standards. Guardian Protocol was not just fraud detection software. It was a living system that required constant care and feeding with administrative protocols hidden so deeply in the architecture that even my own team members did not know they existed. Authentication servers that verified my identity every 4 hours. Learning algorithms that would stop processing new data without my personal encryption keys. Database connections that required my biometric confirmation to maintain full functionality. I had built these fail-safes during my 3rd year after discovering that Harrison's previous security director had been terminated without notice and left the bank vulnerable to attacks for several weeks while replacement staff learned the systems. The experience taught me that job security in corporate America was an illusion, and the only way to protect yourself was to make your expertise irreplaceable. Now those same safeguards were about to demonstrate exactly how replaceable Brandon thought I was. Marcus appeared in my office doorway, carrying a cardboard box of his own possessions. His transfer to consumer lending had been finalized that morning, eliminating the last person who might recognize what was happening to our systems. "This feels wrong," Marcus said quietly, glancing at the security guards before lowering his voice further. 7 years of work just thrown away for some outsourcing experiment. Brandon has no idea what Guardian Protocol actually does. "Things are about to get very interesting around here," I replied, careful not to say anything that could be interpreted as a threat. "Make sure you document everything you see in your new position. I suspect you will witness some unusual patterns in the coming weeks." Marcus understood immediately. His statistical background made him naturally suspicious of dramatic changes in data patterns, and he would be perfectly positioned to observe the chaos that followed Guardian Protocol's shutdown from his new role in consumer lending analysis. 21 minutes remaining. I pulled out my personal smartphone and accessed the emergency administrative interface I had never expected to use. The screen displayed familiar code that looked like routine maintenance commands to anyone without deep system knowledge, but was actually the beginning of the most elegant sabotage ever implemented in corporate computing. The beauty of my shutdown sequence was its subtlety. Rather than causing immediate catastrophic failure, Guardian Protocol would gradually stop functioning over the course of several hours. Authentication servers would begin refusing connections. Pattern recognition engines would revert to default settings that ignored sophisticated fraud techniques. Real-time monitoring systems would develop increasing delays until they stopped responding altogether. To outside observers, the deterioration would look like routine technical problems that could be resolved with standard troubleshooting procedures. Brandon's secure logic consultants would waste precious hours trying to diagnose issues they could not possibly understand, while criminals worldwide took advantage of the growing security gaps. 18 minutes. The first phase of shutdown was already beginning in servers 3 floors below my office. Authentication databases were switching to backup protocols that would function normally for exactly 43 more minutes before requiring administrative passwords that no longer existed. I had one moment of doubt thinking about innocent customers whose accounts might be compromised during the transition period. But my conscience was clear because I had designed the shutdown sequence to trigger immediate federal oversight rather than allowing permanent damage. Banking regulators would be forced to intervene within hours, providing protection that SecureLogic's generic algorithms could never match. 15 minutes. Security guard Robert Chen approached my desk with obvious reluctance. "I am sorry, Miss Walsh, but we have instructions to escort you out now. Building management wants to avoid any potential complications." The irony was perfect. They were removing me from the building to prevent sabotage, completely unaware that the sabotage was already running automatically on servers they could not access, with administrative commands they did not know existed. I stood up from my desk for the last time, taking a final look at the basement office where I had spent 7 years building something beautiful and sophisticated. The servers hummed quietly in their racks, processing millions of transactions and protecting thousands of families from financial predators, completely unaware that their digital immune system was about to shut down forever. 12 minutes. As we walked toward the elevator, I pulled out my phone one more time and executed the final shutdown command with a simple text message that looked like a grocery list to anyone who might intercept it. The message triggered cascading authentication failures that would propagate through Guardian Protocol's entire network, creating technical problems that would escalate from minor inconveniences to complete system paralysis. The elevator doors closed behind me as we rose toward the lobby level, carrying me away from 7 years of my professional life. But Brandon Caldwell was about to learn that firing someone and replacing their expertise were completely different challenges. 11 minutes until First National Bank discovered what losing institutional knowledge really meant. 37 minutes after my escort from the building, I sat in my car in the parking garage across the street, monitoring First National's systems through secure connections that Brandon's team had forgotten to revoke. The beauty of having designed the architecture was knowing exactly where to look for the first signs of catastrophic failure. The initial alerts appeared on fraud monitoring dashboards at exactly 11:43 a.m., just as I had calculated. Routine transaction patterns that should have triggered automatic risk assessments were passing through without analysis. Customer authentication requests that normally completed in milliseconds were timing out after 30 seconds. Regional threat intelligence feeds that updated every 5 minutes had gone silent. Brandon's secure logic consultants, led by a young systems analyst named Kevin Park, began troubleshooting what they assumed were routine technical glitches. Their response was textbook corporate IT support: restart, the obvious services check network connections, call vendor support lines for guidance that would never come. But Guardian Protocol was not failing randomly. Every shutdown sequence had been carefully designed to cascade through the system's most critical dependencies, creating problems that appeared unrelated to anyone without complete architectural knowledge. Authentication servers reported healthy status while refusing all actual login attempts. Database connections tested successfully while blocking all fraud detection queries. Network interfaces showed normal traffic while routing critical alerts to non-existent destinations. By 12:15 p.m., Kevin's team was frantically escalating issues to SecureLogic's Mumbai headquarters, where programmers who had never seen American banking systems struggled to understand error messages that made no technical sense. The Mumbai team had extensive experience with their standardized platform, but Guardian Protocol's custom architecture might as well have been written in an alien programming language. The first successful fraud attack came at 12:31 p.m., a coordinated identity theft operation targeting elderly customers in suburban Denver. Criminals had been monitoring banking security systems for weeks, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Guardian Protocol would have flagged the suspicious patterns within seconds, but the dead authentication servers allowed $63,000 in unauthorized withdrawals before human analysts noticed the unusual activity. Brandon appeared in the Fraud Monitoring Center at 12:45 p.m., his confident demeanor beginning to crack as Kevin explained the rapidly deteriorating situation. The sophisticated executive suite confidence was giving way to something approaching panic as he realized his cost-cutting measure was becoming a public relations disaster. "How long until SecureLogic's platform is fully operational?" Brandon demanded, studying monitors that displayed cascading system failures across the entire fraud detection network. Kevin's answer was devastating in its honesty. SecureLogic estimates 72 hours for complete deployment and configuration. Their standard platform needs extensive customization to integrate with American banking protocols and regulatory requirements. 72 hours without fraud protection for 8.7 million customer accounts. 72 hours for every criminal organization in the world to launch coordinated attacks against a defenseless target. 72 hours for Brandon's cost-cutting experiment to destroy his family's banking empire. The second wave of attacks began at 1:15 p.m., this time targeting commercial business accounts with sophisticated wire transfer fraud that would have been impossible with Guardian Protocol active. Criminals in Eastern Europe had clearly been preparing for this moment, launching precisely coordinated operations that exploited every gap in the dying security infrastructure. Federal bank examiners arrived at 2:30 p.m., responding to automated alerts triggered by the unusual transaction patterns. Guardian Protocol's final gift was a dead man's switch that notified regulatory authorities whenever fraud detection capabilities were compromised, ensuring that government oversight would activate before criminal exploitation could cause permanent damage. The arrival of federal investigators transformed Brandon's technical crisis into a compliance nightmare. Banking regulations required continuous fraud monitoring capabilities, and First National was now in clear violation of multiple federal statutes. The examiners began documenting every policy failure and regulatory breach with the methodical precision that only government bureaucrats can achieve. By 3 p.m., news outlets had picked up reports of unusual activity at First National's headquarters. Local television crews gathered outside the building as federal agents carried boxes of evidence to unmarked vehicles. The carefully managed corporate image that Harrison Caldwell had spent decades building was crumbling in real time on live television. The investigation expanded rapidly as federal authorities discovered the paper trail I had left documenting Brandon's violations of banking regulations. Every email about the SecureLogic contract, every kickback payment hidden in consulting fees, every regulatory requirement that had been ignored in pursuit of cost savings was preserved in secure files that only law enforcement could access. Harrison Caldwell arrived at the bank at 4:30 p.m., his usual composed demeanor shattered by the magnitude of the crisis engulfing his life's work. The man who had dismissed my leadership potential was now facing federal criminal charges because he had trusted his son's business judgment over proven expertise. The most beautiful irony came when investigators revealed that SecureLogic Solutions was itself under federal investigation for fraudulent business practices and had been operating in the United States without proper regulatory licenses. Brandon's flagship modernization initiative was not just technically inadequate, but legally problematic, exposing First National to criminal liability for knowingly contracting with unlicensed vendors. By 6 p.m., total losses from successful fraud attacks had exceeded $37 million, making First National's security failure one of the largest in regional banking history. The number was particularly damaging because it represented more money than Brandon's outsourcing plan would have saved over 5 years, proving that his cost-cutting measures were actually far more expensive than the systems he had eliminated. Media coverage exploded as journalists discovered the family drama underlying the banking crisis. Headlines across Colorado focused on nepotism and corporate greed, with Brandon portrayed as the spoiled heir whose arrogance had destroyed a respected financial institution. Editorial writers demanded answers about executive accountability and regulatory oversight failures. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened a formal investigation into possible securities fraud, examining whether First National's leadership had deliberately misrepresented the bank's security capabilities to investors and regulators. The FBI launched a parallel criminal investigation focusing on the kickbacks Brandon had received from SecureLogic and the deliberate circumvention of federal banking oversight requirements. Brandon's arrest came at 8 p.m. Federal agents reading charges of racketeering, bribery, and endangering the financial system while news cameras captured every humiliating moment. The young man who had dismissed my expertise as outdated legacy thinking was now facing 12 years in federal prison for his innovative leadership approach. Harrison Caldwell's arrest followed 2 hours later, federal prosecutors arguing that his oversight failures constituted criminal negligence rather than simple mismanagement. The respected banking leader, who had never believed women possessed executive leadership qualities, was now learning about accountability from female federal prosecutors who clearly possessed exactly the killer instinct he thought was missing. As I watched the evening news coverage from my apartment, I felt the satisfaction that comes from seeing justice served through consequences rather than revenge. I had not destroyed Brandon's career out of spite or personal animosity. I had simply removed the safeguards that protected his incompetence from natural consequences, allowing his decisions to speak for themselves. The banking industry would recover from this crisis stronger and more secure, with new regulations protecting whistleblowers and requiring proper oversight of outsourcing decisions. Innocent customers would be protected by federal deposit insurance and regulatory intervention. And future executives would think twice before dismissing institutional expertise in favor of cost-cutting experiments. Brandon Caldwell had taught me an invaluable lesson about corporate loyalty and professional respect. Now I had returned the favor by teaching him about consequences and accountability. 6 months after watching Brandon Caldwell's empire crumble, I found myself in a place I never expected, testifying before the United States Senate Banking Committee about corporate fraud vulnerabilities and the critical importance of institutional knowledge in financial security. The witness table in the Hart Senate office building felt surreal after 7 years in a basement office, but the senator's questions demonstrated genuine understanding of the technical issues that had been dismissed as irrelevant legacy concerns by Brandon's consulting team. Senator Patricia Williams from Colorado led the questioning with the kind of detailed preparation that reminded me why elections matter. Ms. Walsh, your experience at First National Bank illustrates systemic problems in how financial institutions value cybersecurity expertise, Senator Williams said, consulting notes that showed she had actually read my written testimony. Can you explain how proper oversight might have prevented this crisis? My answer focused on the need for technical advisory boards with actual cybersecurity experience, rather than allowing business executives to make security decisions based solely on cost considerations. The committee was drafting legislation that would require banks to maintain minimum levels of internal security expertise and establish whistleblower protections for employees who reported regulatory violations. The legislation, which became known as the Walsh Financial Security Act, represented everything I had hoped to achieve through 7 years of dedicated work. Federal regulations now required banks to demonstrate continuous fraud monitoring capabilities and prohibited outsourcing critical security functions to unlicensed providers. Most importantly, the law protected employees who reported security violations from retaliation and provided clear channels for communicating concerns to federal regulators. Harrison Caldwell received a 5-year federal prison sentence after pleading guilty to regulatory violations and obstruction of justice. His attempts to portray himself as a victim of his son's poor judgment failed when prosecutors demonstrated that he had actively participated in covering up Brandon's illegal activities. The man who had claimed women lacked executive leadership qualities was now learning about accountability from federal judges who clearly possessed the killer instinct he thought was missing. Brandon's sentence was more severe: 12 years for racketeering, bribery, and endangering the financial system. Federal prosecutors argued that his privileged background made his crimes more serious not less because he had betrayed trust that came with family wealth and corporate responsibility. His Wharton MBA became evidence of sophisticated knowledge rather than a credential supporting leniency arguments. First National Bank lost its federal charter after investigators discovered the security failures were part of a broader pattern of regulatory violations dating back several years. The institution that had employed me for 7 years was dissolved with customer accounts transferred to more responsible financial institutions that maintained proper security standards. But the most satisfying outcome was personal rather than legal. Within weeks of my Senate testimony, I received job offers from 17 different financial institutions, all competing to hire someone with proven expertise in fraud detection and regulatory compliance. The skill set that Brandon had dismissed as outdated legacy knowledge was suddenly the most valuable commodity in American banking. I chose Colorado Community Credit Union, a nonprofit financial institution dedicated to serving working families rather than maximizing executive compensation. The credit union's mission reminded me why I had entered banking in the first place, protecting ordinary people from financial predators who viewed customer accounts as opportunities for exploitation. My new position as Chief Security Officer came with unprecedented authority and compensation, but more importantly, it came with institutional respect for technical expertise. The credit union's board included actual cybersecurity professionals who understood the value of continuous system development and innovation. My recommendations were evaluated based on technical merit rather than cost reduction potential. The Sentinel Protocol, my new fraud detection system for Colorado Community Credit Union, incorporated everything I had learned from building Guardian Protocol while adding new capabilities designed specifically for community banking environments. The system's focus on protecting families and small businesses created different technical challenges that required innovative solutions. Within 18 months, Sentinel Protocol became the industry standard for community financial institutions across the Western United States. My expertise was no longer confined to one bank's basement office, but was protecting millions of families through a network of credit unions and community banks that prioritized security over profit margins. The personal transformation was as important as the professional success. 7 years of loyalty to an institution that did not value my contributions had taught me to demand respect rather than hoping for recognition. I learned to document workplace violations systematically and trust my professional judgment even when corporate leadership disagreed with my conclusions. Speaking engagements at Women in Technology conferences became opportunities to share hard-earned wisdom about navigating corporate environments that undervalue technical expertise. My presentations focused on practical advice: document everything, build professional networks outside your immediate workplace, never assume institutional loyalty will protect you from economic pressures. The audiences were filled with brilliant women facing similar challenges in male-dominated industries. Software engineers whose innovations were attributed to male colleagues, cybersecurity analysts whose warnings were ignored until disasters proved them correct, network architects whose expertise was dismissed as unnecessary complexity by executives focused on quarterly profit reports. My message to them was simple but revolutionary. Your expertise has value, independent of corporate recognition. Your professional judgment deserves respect, regardless of management opinions. And sometimes protecting your own interests requires decisive action rather than patient loyalty. The question I asked every audience was the same one that had driven my decision to embed safeguards in Guardian Protocol. When leadership fails to value institutional knowledge, who takes responsibility for protecting the mission that originally motivated your dedication? For me, the answer had been clear. Sometimes you have to burn bridges to build better ones, and when people show you who they really are, through their actions, believe them the first time and protect yourself accordingly. The young woman who had walked into First National's marble lobby at 25 with dreams of revolutionizing financial security had learned that revolution sometimes requires destroying systems that resist necessary change. Brandon Caldwell had taught me that loyalty means nothing without mutual respect, and I had returned the favor by teaching him that expertise cannot be replaced with arrogance and cost-cutting measures. As I concluded my remarks at each conference, I would look out at audiences filled with talented women facing their own corporate challenges, and offer the same encouragement that had carried me through 7 years of undervaluation and ultimate vindication. Trust your abilities, document your contributions, and never let anyone convince you that experience is less valuable than enthusiasm or that institutional knowledge is less important than disruptive innovation. The banking industry was stronger and more secure because someone had finally held leadership accountable for valuing cost savings over customer protection. Thousands of families were safer because regulatory oversight had been strengthened and whistleblower protections had been established. And one woman had learned that sometimes the most professional thing you can do is refuse to enable institutional incompetence. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your expertise was dismissed by leadership who prioritized cost-cutting over quality results? How did you protect your professional integrity when corporate loyalty was not reciprocated? I would love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with your own workplace challenges, please like this video to help others find encouragement in standing up for their professional values. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming corporate injustice and workplace discrimination. And please share this with anyone who needs to hear that expertise matters more than executive politics. Thank you for listening to my journey from corporate basement to Senate testimony. Remember that your knowledge and dedication have value regardless of whether current leadership recognizes that truth. Sometimes protecting what you have built requires courage to let others face the consequences of their poor judgment. Stay strong, trust your expertise, and never let anyone convince you that loyalty requires accepting disrespect.